My name is Renata, and I was 34 years old when my brother handed me a moving notice the morning after we buried our mother. He didn't call first. He didn't knock. He walked into the kitchen of the house I had been driving 4 hours each way to reach every single weekend for 3 years, set an envelope on the counter next to the coffee I had just made, and said, "Mom took care of it. You have 60 days." The cruel part wasn't the envelope. It was what he said next when I didn't move. "You were always too emotional to handle property, Renata." Mom knew that. She just never wanted to say it to your face. I picked up my coffee. I didn't pour it on him. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at him for a long moment and I said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that before her memory began to slip, before the second fall, before any of this, my mother had made a phone call to a specific office about a specific document. And that document had a date on it. That date was going to matter more than Marcus could possibly imagine. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the shouting. If you're new here, hit subscribe, and if you've ever been handed an envelope when you deserved a thank you, drop a comment below. You're in the right place. I should tell you about the house first because the house is the whole story. It's a 3-bedroom craftsman on a corner lot in a small city called Millhaven, in the kind of state where property values creep up slowly and then, one decade, don't creep anymore, they leap. My parents bought it in 1987 for what was, even then, not very much money. My father refinished the porch himself. My mother planted a row of rose bushes along the east fence that, by the time I was old enough to notice them, had grown into something that looked like they'd always been there, like they were part of the original architecture. The house had a particular smell in the mornings, old wood and drier heat, and, if she'd been baking, something warm underneath all of it. I grew up in that smell. My father died when I was 19. Heart, sudden, a Thursday in November. He was 52. My brother Marcus was 22 and already 3 years into a life that had nothing to do with Millhaven. He'd gone to a school in the Pacific Northwest on a partial scholarship, stayed for a woman, and then stayed longer because leaving felt like admitting something. After my father died, Marcus came home for the service and then went back. I don't say that with bitterness. People live their lives. I say it because it's part of the record. I stayed closer. Not in Millhaven itself. I'd built a life in Crestfield, which is about a 4-hour drive, roughly 240 miles, mostly highway with one long stretch of state road that I came to know in every season, in every weather condition, in the dark and in the rain, and once, memorably, in a near whiteout in February that added an hour and a half to the trip. I knew that road. I knew the rest stop at mile marker 91 where the vending machine always had the same thing in it. I knew the gas station at the Millhaven exit where the attendant, a man named Gus who had to have been in his 70s, would wave at every car like he recognized them personally. What I did in Crestfield, I was a respiratory therapist at a mid-sized hospital. I had an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that had good bones and indifferent management. I had a small circle of friends, a car that needed more maintenance than it got, and a habit of calling my mother every evening around 8 o'clock, after her shows and before she fell asleep. My mother's name was Dolores. Everyone called her Dolly, which she tolerated from family and nobody else. She was, in the way of certain women of her generation, quietly formidable. She kept her own counsel. She had opinions she didn't volunteer. She had a way of listening to you that made you feel she was filing everything away somewhere, and she had the memory of a court reporter until the last couple of years, when things began to slip in the small ways that anyone who has watched it knows, not actually small at all. She had her first fall when she was 71. A step missed in the dark, nothing broken, but it scared her, and it scared me, because I'd been paying attention to the other things, the repeated questions, the small confusions, the occasional morning when she would call me by my aunt's name before correcting herself with a little laugh that was too quick to be entirely comfortable. I started calling more. Then I started driving down more. Every other weekend at first, then most weekends, then every weekend I could manage without losing my job, which I was very careful not to do, because I had a life to maintain, and a mother who would have been mortified to know her care was costing me my professional standing. My supervisor, a woman named Andrea who had the particular gift of being direct without being unkind, sat me down in her office during my second year of the schedule and said, "Renata, I want to make sure we're doing this sustainably." I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way people look at you, when they know you're not fine, but respect you enough not to argue. She approved my flex schedule. I worked 4 longer days and had Fridays off, which meant I could leave Thursday evening and have almost 3 full days in Millhaven before driving back Sunday night to sleep a few hours and be at work Monday morning. I did that for 3 years. The drive was 240 miles, twice, every week. That is, over 3 years, roughly 75,000 miles. I know that number because I calculated it once, sitting in my car in my mother's driveway on a Sunday evening in March, watching the light go out of the kitchen window as she turned off the lamp the way she always did, and I thought, I should know this number. I should have it. Not as a grievance, just as a fact that belonged to me. What did I do in Millhaven those weekends? Everything that needed doing. Groceries, which by the second year I was doing twice on each visit because she would forget I'd already been to the store. Medications, which I organized into a pill caddy every Sunday and labeled in large print because her glasses were never quite the right prescription and she was stubborn about updating them. Appointments, the GP, the cardiologist twice, the geriatric specialist her GP finally referred her to in year 2, who was a careful, precise man named Dr. Pham who told me, in the hallway while my mother was putting her coat on, that she was doing as well as could be expected, and that consistent presence was the single most stabilizing factor for patients in her situation. I wrote that down. Consistent presence. I wrote it in the small notebook I'd started keeping for her care, medications, appointments, what she'd eaten, how her sleep had been, whether she'd been confused or clear. I have 6 of those notebooks. I kept them in a shoebox in my closet. I don't know why I kept them. I think I knew, somewhere underneath everything, that records were going to matter. Marcus came at Christmas the first year. He stayed 4 days, declared that Mom seemed sharp as ever. She had a very good week, I should note, and I'd done the grocery run the day before his arrival and tidied the house to a standard she hadn't been maintaining on her own, and flew back to Portland. He came at Christmas the second year, for 3 days. He called on her birthday. He called on Mother's Day. When I called him in March of the third year to tell him that Dr. Pham was recommending we begin looking at part-time and home assistance, he said, "Is it really that bad? She sounded fine when I called her last week." I held the phone for a moment. Then I said, "She asked me what my father was doing for dinner, Marcus." Twice. On the same call. There was a silence. Then, okay. Well, let's not overreact. She's always been a little scattered. I said, "I'll look into the home care options and let you know what I find." He said, "Sounds good." And then, after a beat, "Hey, you know I would come more if I could. It's a lot, with work and everything." I said, "I know." He had no idea what I knew. The anchor of the house, the thing that made it the house, the thing that made it mean what it meant, was my grandmother's sewing table. It was a small thing, cherrywood, with a fold-out surface and 3 drawers on each side, the kind of furniture that doesn't get made anymore, or if it does, it doesn't have the weight of the original. My grandmother, Nana Eunice, had brought it from her home in Savannah when she and my grandfather moved north in the early 60s. It had sat in the corner of the front bedroom in every house she ever lived in after that. When she died, she left it to my mother, and my mother put it in the same corner of the same room where she'd always had her own small writing desk, because she understood the geometry of those things. I used to sit at that table as a child. I wasn't sewing, I was drawing mostly and then doing homework, and then later, after my father died, just sitting. There was something about that table that was about continuity, about being in a line of women who had held things together. My mother, in one of her clearer moments during my 3rd year of weekend visits, told me she wanted me to have it. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. I'd made her favorite, a simple roast chicken with the herbs from her garden, which I'd started maintaining because she'd stopped being able to keep track of the watering, and she looked at the doorway to the front bedroom and said, very clearly, "I want you to have Mama's table, Rennie, when the time comes. You understand me?" I said yes. I understood. She patted my hand, once, twice. Her hand was small and very dry, and still strong in the way that women who worked their whole lives have a physical strength that outlasts the softening of everything else. She said, I've tried to be fair. I've tried to do right by both of you. I didn't ask her what she meant. I should have, maybe. But she said it in a way that felt finished, and I didn't want to push her when she was being clear, because those moments were precious and I didn't want to complicate one. That was in October. She died in February. She died on a Wednesday, early morning, in Millhaven General. She'd been admitted the previous Thursday after her second fall, this one involving the back step and a patch of ice that the neighbor's boy usually salted but hadn't gotten to that morning. The fall fractured her left wrist, which was a problem, but the real problem was what they found when they got her stable. Her heart had been working too hard for too long, and the combination of the stress and the cold had pushed it somewhere it couldn't come back from easily. I got the call at 2 a.m. Thursday. I was already in the car by 2:20. Marcus arrived Saturday afternoon. He flew into the nearest regional airport, 2 hours away, and took a car service because his flight had been delayed and he hadn't wanted to rent. He arrived at the hospital smelling of the airplane and whatever coffee he'd gotten at the airport, and he hugged me in the hallway outside her room and said, "How is she?" And I said, "Sleeping." "She's comfortable." And he looked at me and I could see something shifting in his face, something adjusting. The doctors were honest with us. There was a window, but it was narrow. They were keeping her comfortable. There were things we could do, and things we couldn't. What Marcus and I did, in those 4 days between his arrival and her death, was exist in the same space in a way we hadn't for years. We took shifts. We ate bad cafeteria food. We talked, sometimes, about things that weren't about her. Old stories, things from childhood, the time our father drove the wrong direction for 40 minutes before admitting it. It was, in a strange way, one of the more real conversations we'd had in years. My mother died on Wednesday at 4:17 a.m. I was holding her hand. Marcus had fallen asleep in the chair in the corner and woke when the machines changed. The nurse was very kind. She had seen this before, of course, many times, and she had the gift of being present without intruding. We sat with our mother for a while. Then we went out to the hallway. Marcus cried, hard, briefly, with a kind of surprised quality, like he hadn't expected his own body to do that. I put my hand on his back. I said, "It's okay." Because it was, in the way that deaths after long illnesses can be okay. She had not been in pain. She had been held. We drove to the house together in the early morning dark. I made coffee. We sat in her kitchen surrounded by everything she'd owned, and I thought, this is the house where she made every one of her decisions. Every piece of furniture. Every dish. Every year. 2 days later, Marcus called a family meeting. Not with cousins or extended relatives, just the two of us, at her kitchen table. He had a folder. That was the first thing I noticed. He had a manila folder with a little stack of papers in it, the kind you bring to something official. He put it on the table and he said, "So, I've been in touch with an attorney here in Millhaven, just to start getting a handle on the estate situation. Mom had a will. I found it in her desk. You knew about it, right?" I said yes, I knew. She told me about it years ago, a simple document, everything split, standard. He nodded.
Right.
So that's fine. That's straightforward. But there's also the house. I looked at him. He opened the folder. Inside was a deed. Not the original deed. I knew the original deed was in the firebox in the hallway closet. I'd helped her find it once for a refinancing she'd considered and then decided against. This was something else. It was dated 14 months earlier. It transferred the property from Dolores Osei, sole owner, to Marcus Osei. I looked at the document for a long time without touching it. "She signed it over," Marcus said. He said it carefully in a tone that was measured, that was, I realized, prepared. About 14 months ago. She wanted the house to stay in the family in one continuous ownership, and we talked about it, she and I, over the phone, and she agreed that it made more sense for it to come to me. I'm the oldest. I can actually maintain a property. I wasn't going to bring this up right away. I know the timing is hard, but we need to start thinking practically. I said, very quietly, "You talked to her about this over the phone." "Multiple times," he said.
She was clear about it.
She was having a good stretch. You know, she had good stretches. I said, 14 months ago, she was asking me what year it was, Marcus. On a good day. He looked at me, and I watched something harden just slightly behind his eyes. Not cruelty, not exactly, but the look of someone who has decided on a position and will hold it. The attorney reviewed it. It's a valid document. Her signature, a notary, all of it. He paused. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but she was my mother too, and this is what she wanted. He slid the folder a few inches toward me. You have 60 days, he said. I'll make sure you can get everything you need from the house. We'll divide the furniture fairly. You can have whatever you want within reason. He paused again, and then he said the thing that I would hear in my head on the drive home, and on every day that followed, and that I would hear again when I was sitting across from a title officer 3 weeks later. You were always too emotional to handle property, Renata. Mom knew that. She just never wanted to say it to your face. I sat with that for a moment. My hands, I noticed, were very still on the table. Something in my chest had dropped low and gone quiet. I looked at my brother. I said, okay. I picked up my coffee. I drank it. I said, I'll need a copy of that document. He looked slightly surprised. I think he'd prepared for an argument, for tears, for something. He said, of course. He made a copy on my mother's printer in the little alcove off the kitchen. I folded it, put it in my jacket pocket, and said I was going to get some air. I walked out to the backyard. The rose bushes were still there along the east fence, pruned back for winter, bare and architectural. My father had helped plant them. They'd be 37 years old in the spring. I stood at the fence for a while. Then I took out my phone and made a call. Not to a friend, not to a lawyer, not to anyone who would offer comfort. I called the county recorder's office for Millhaven County, and I asked a very specific question about property records, and I was told what I needed to know about how to request a full title history for a given address. Because here is the thing about my mother that Marcus had always underestimated. She was, in her clearer years, a meticulous woman. She kept records. She kept copies. She had, for 20 years, used the same attorney, a woman named Patricia Weld, who had offices on the second floor of a building on Cartwright Street in downtown Millhaven, and who had drawn up my mother's will, and who had, I happen to know, been the person my mother called about certain property matters 2 years before she signed anything Marcus put in front of her. I knew this because my mother had mentioned it, casually, on a Saturday afternoon when I was doing her grocery run, and she was sitting at Nana Eunice's sewing table, going through a box of papers. She'd said, I called Patricia today about the house, about making sure it goes the right way. I'd said, that's smart, Mom. And I hadn't thought about it again until I was standing in her backyard, looking at her rose bushes, with my brother's deed folded in my pocket. The date my mother had mentioned? 2 years before Marcus's deed. 2 years before anyone had talked to her on the phone about property during a good stretch. The weeks after the funeral were practical and painful in the way that the administrative aftermath of a death always is. Death certificates, bank accounts, utilities, subscriptions to cancel, a newspaper delivery that kept coming for 3 weeks because no one could figure out who had set it up. Marcus returned to Portland after the service, which was attended by about 60 people, neighbors and old friends, and 2 women from her church who had been visiting her every other week for years and who I had never thought to mention to Marcus because I hadn't thought he'd need to know. He flew back with an air of someone who had handled his affairs. I stayed another 4 days. I sorted through her papers. I boxed the things that were clearly mine. Photographs, the small jewelry she'd told me she wanted me to have, a cookbook with her handwriting in the margins. I did not touch Nana Eunice's sewing table. I left it where it was. On the last morning, I drove to Cartwright Street, and I went upstairs to Patricia Weld's office. Patricia Weld was a woman in her mid-60s with very short white hair and reading glasses on a chain, and the air of someone who had seen the full range of what families do to each other when property is involved. Her assistant had fit me in for what she called a brief consultation, 30 minutes. Patricia listened to me for about 10 of those minutes without interrupting or taking notes, just listening, and at the end she said, "Do you have the deed he showed you?" I gave her the copy. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "All right. I'm going to pull the title history on that address. Your mother was a client of mine, which gives me certain standing here. Can you come back Thursday?" I changed my return drive. I came back Thursday. What Patricia Weld handed me on Thursday afternoon was a printed title history for the property at 412 Fenwick Lane, Millhaven, the address I had been driving 4 hours each way to reach every weekend for 3 years. It showed every instrument on record for that property going back to my parents' original purchase in 1987. The most recent instrument was Marcus's deed, dated 14 months ago. The second most recent was a deed dated 26 months ago, filed with the county recorder's office, notarized, signed, witnessed, and entirely valid, that transferred the property into a revocable living trust. The named trustee of that trust, and the sole named beneficiary upon the grantor's death, was Renata Osei. Patricia Weld said, "Your mother established this trust 2 years ago, before the cognitive decline was as pronounced." I drew it up. It was her explicit instruction that it be structured this way. A transfer into trust supersedes a subsequent deed transfer if the grantor lacked capacity at the time of the second transaction, which, given the medical records you've described, is exactly what any competent attorney is going to find when they look at this. She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Your brother's deed may be on file, but it is not valid. The trust document predates it by 14 months. Your mother, in the period when she was still fully competent to make decisions, made this decision." Something in my shoulders went very quiet. I said, "What happens now?" She said, "I recommend we go to the county recorder's office together with the trust document and request a formal title review. The title officer there will need to reconcile the two instruments. When they do, there's only one conclusion."
She paused.
"I'd like you to contact your brother and tell him to be present. He should hear this directly." I said, "Will he be angry?" She said, "Probably. Then, but the document says what it says." I texted Marcus that afternoon. I kept the text simple. "There are some questions about the title to the house. Patricia Weld, Mom's attorney, thinks we should both be present for a title review at the county recorder's office. Are you able to come back to Millhaven next week?" He called me within 5 minutes. "What kind of questions?" he said. "Not a question. A statement said in the shape of a question." I said, "Patricia thinks there may be 2 instruments on record. She wants the title officer to look at both." A pause. "I had that deed reviewed, Renata. It's valid." "I know you did," I said. "I just think this is worth doing properly. For both of us. So there's no dispute down the line." Another pause. Longer. "Fine," he said. "I'll come Thursday." He brought his attorney. He was a man named Derek, youngish, a property lawyer Marcus had found through someone at his firm, and he arrived with a leather portfolio and the confident manner of someone accustomed to being the most legally informed person in the room. He shook Patricia Weld's hand with the extra firmness men sometimes use when they want to establish something. The county recorder's office in Millhaven is on the 2nd floor of the municipal building on Bridge Street, a functional civic space with fluorescent lighting and the particular smell of government buildings everywhere, carpet cleaner and old paper and something faintly metallic. The title officer assigned to our case was a woman named Carol Hutchins, who had been with the office for, I later learned, 22 years. She was compact and precise, and when I came in she shook my hand first, and then Patricia's, and then looked at both men, without any particular expression. There were 5 of us in the review room. Carol Hutchins, Patricia Weld, me, Marcus, and Derek. There was a table with a pitcher of water and a box of tissues that I thought was a very considered touch. There was a window that looked out onto a parking lot. The light was flat and cold. Carol set 2 documents in the center of the table. Marcus had not seen the trust document before that moment. I watched his eyes find the date at the top of it, 26 months ago, and I watched something in his jaw shift. Derek leaned over and looked at it, and I saw his expression change in a small way that he tried immediately to control. Carol said, "I've reviewed both instruments on file for the property at 412 Fenwick Lane. I want to walk both parties through my findings." She said it in the tone of someone who had done this before for other families, other tables, other men with leather portfolios. She began with the deed Marcus had filed, his document, his date, his notarization. She explained its contents, its form, its apparent validity on its face. Derek nodded at appropriate moments. Marcus sat with his hands flat on the table. Then Carol picked up the trust document. She said, "This instrument was filed with this office 26 months ago. It is a revocable living trust establishing the property at 412 Fenwick Lane as a trust asset, with Dolores Osei as grantor and trustee during her lifetime, and Renata Osei as successor trustee and sole beneficiary upon the grantor's death." She looked up. The trust document predates the quitclaim deed by 14 months. The room was very still. Carol continued, "Under applicable state law, a trust transfer is a completed conveyance at the time of filing. A subsequent deed from the original grantor cannot transfer property that has already been placed in trust, regardless of the grantor's intent at the time of the second instrument, particularly where, as here, there are questions of testamentary capacity." She set the document down. "My finding is that the property at 412 Fenwick Lane passed to the named trust beneficiary, Renata Osei, at the time of the grantor's death. The quitclaim deed filed 14 months after the trust instrument has no legal effect on the trust property." She picked up her pen and made a notation on the file in front of her. Marcus did not speak. His hands were still flat on the table, but they had gone white at the knuckles. Derek had opened his portfolio and was looking at something inside it, not reading it, I thought, just giving his eyes somewhere to go. I looked at the window. The parking lot. A woman in a red coat walking to her car. Carol Hutchins was not done. She set a third sheet on the table, a printed summary of the title history, the same document Patricia had shown me on Thursday. She walked through it point by point. The original purchase, the refinancing consideration my mother had decided against, the trust filing. Then she said, "I also want to note for the record that at the time the trust was established, the grantor was assessed by her primary care physician as having full testamentary capacity. I have a copy of that assessment on file as part of the trust documentation, which was submitted by the drafting attorney." She looked at Patricia. "At the time of filing. That assessment is dated 2 years and 1 month ago." Patricia had thought of everything. Carol folded her hands and said, "If there are questions about capacity at the time of the quitclaim deed, which is dated 14 months ago, those would need to be addressed in a separate proceeding. But as a matter of the title record before this office, the trust instrument controls." Derek said, carefully, "The quitclaim was notarized. There's a presumption of capacity." Patricia said, "There's a rebuttable presumption, yes. And you're welcome to litigate that. But you would be litigating against a prior-in-time trust instrument with an accompanying capacity assessment, against a medical record showing documented cognitive decline beginning approximately 18 months ago, and against a treating physician who is prepared to testify to the timeline." She said it without heat, without emphasis, just as a statement of the landscape. "I would suggest to your client that this is a road that ends in one place." The room was quiet for a moment. I looked at Marcus. He had not moved. His face had done something complicated. The color had gone out of it, and something else had come in, something I recognized not as anger, but as the specific, physical experience of a story collapsing. I had watched him build a story. The phone calls, the good stretch, the deed he'd had reviewed, the 60 days. I had watched him believe it, maybe, or at least believe in it well enough to arrive here with a leather portfolio attorney and the posture of someone handling an administrative formality. He said very quietly, "She talked to me about it. She was clear." I said, just as quietly, "She talked to Patricia about it too, Marcus. 2 years ago, when she was clear." He looked at me. I looked back at him. I did not look away. What I felt in that moment, I won't name it because naming it makes it smaller than it was. What I can tell you is that something in my chest that had been clenched since the morning I drove 4 hours after a 2 a.m. call opened, just slightly, like a window in a room that has been closed too long. Like the first air getting in. Carol Hutchins said, into the silence, "I'll update the title record accordingly. The property will reflect the trust instrument. If there are further proceedings, that would be a matter for the courts rather than this office." She began gathering her documents. She said, "Is there anything else either party needs?" "Nobody said anything," she said. "Then we're done here." Patricia Weld had one more thing to say before we left the building. She had waited until Derek and Marcus were in the hallway. I could hear Derek talking in a low, careful voice, the kind of voice that means this is recoverable. I have a plan, stay calm. And she turned to me and said, "There's one more thing in the trust document I want to make sure you saw." She unfolded her copy of the trust, she'd brought two, and turned to the second page. There was a section, paragraph 6, headed Personal Property. It listed specific items. The first one, item A, was the cherrywood sewing table belonging to the grantor's mother, Eunice Calloway, to be retained by or delivered to the trust beneficiary as a matter of personal significance to the family line. My mother had put it in the document, by name. She had thought about that table. She had thought about where it should go, and she had written it down, and she had filed it with the county and dated it and had her capacity assessed and attached that assessment to the filing. I stood in the hallway of the Millhaven Municipal Building and I looked at paragraph 6, item A, and something went entirely still inside me. The kind of stillness that isn't emptiness but completeness. I said, "She knew." Patricia said, "She knew." Derek left the building first, making a call before he'd reached the door. Marcus stood in the hallway for a moment, and then he came to where I was standing. He looked older than he had at the beginning of the week. There was something around his eyes that hadn't been there. He said, "I need to understand what happens now." I said, "The house is in trust for me. That's what happens now." He said, "I had it reviewed, Renata. My attorney looked at that deed." "He looked at the deed," I said. "He didn't look at the full title history." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "What about the contents? There are things in that house that should come to me too." I said, "There's an inventory attached to the trust document. We can go through it." I paused. "Whatever isn't listed in the trust document, we'll divide fairly." I was always going to do that. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not anger, not quite. Something more complicated. He said, "I should have come more." He said it like a statement of fact, not an apology, like he was recording it. I said, "Yes." He didn't say anything else for a moment. Then, "She really filed that 2 years ago." 26 months, I said. Before the second fall. Before Dr. Pham. She was clear. She knew what she was doing. I watched something move through him. His jaw worked once, twice. His hands, I noticed, were very still at his sides. He said, "Can I at least have the framed photo from her bedroom? The one of the 4 of us at the lake." I said, "I already set it aside for you." Because I had. I'd set it aside the week after the funeral, when I was sorting through her things, because I had known even then, even before Patricia's office, even before the title history, that there were things in that house that belonged to both of us regardless of what any document said. My mother had loved both her children. She had also made her decision. Those things were not in conflict. He nodded once. He left. The house sat on its corner lot in Millhaven all through March and into April, quiet, its rose bushes beginning to show the first small signs of the season. I drove back 4 times in those 2 months, not to stay, not to manage anything, just to be there, in the house where I grew up, in the kitchen where my mother had made every meal, at the table where she had made her decisions. I had conversations with a local property manager about rental options, and conversations with a real estate attorney in Millhaven about the trust administration, and conversations with my own financial advisor in Crestfield about what it meant, practically, to own a property assessed at just under $300,000 outright with no mortgage, in a market that had been appreciating at approximately 6% per year. I did not tell people. I didn't post about it. I didn't have a conversation with coworkers or neighbors framed around, "You won't believe what happened." I told 2 people. Andrea, my supervisor, because she had watched me run myself across 240 miles of highway for 3 years, and I felt she deserved to know it hadn't been for nothing, and my closest friend, a woman named Jo who had listened to me on the phone on too many Sunday nights when I was driving back from Millhaven in the dark. Jo said, when I told her, "Your mother set that up on purpose." I said, "I know." She said, "She knew you'd be the one." I said, "She always knew." Marcus called in April. Not angry, not argumentative, quieter than I expected. He said Derek had reviewed everything and there was nothing to pursue, that the trust document was clean, that he understood the situation. He said, I'm going to need some time with this. I said, that's okay. He said, I want to have a relationship with you, Renata. I know I haven't, he stopped. Started again. I know I wasn't there the way you were. I said, I know. He said, that's not nothing. I said, no, it's not. We were quiet for a moment on the phone, two people who had grown up in the same house and then become, over decades, almost strangers, standing at the edge of something that might be a different kind of relationship or might be distance maintained more honestly. He said, will you keep the house? I said, I don't know yet. And that was true. I genuinely didn't know. I had options I hadn't had before, and options are a different kind of weight than obligations, lighter, but still weight, still requiring something of you. I had a house on a corner lot with 37-year-old rose bushes along the east fence and a sewing table inside it that had traveled from Savannah to here over 6 decades and 3 generations of women who had, in their various ways, held things together. I had time to decide. In the second week of May, on a Saturday morning, I drove the 240 miles to Millhaven for the first time without a to-do list. No groceries to organize. No medications to sort.
No appointments.
I just drove the road I knew. The rest stop at mile marker 91, the gas station at the exit where Gus, improbably, was still there and waved, and I pulled into the driveway of 412, Fenwick Lane, and sat in the car for a minute before going inside. The house was quiet, with that particular quiet of empty houses that have recently been lived in. Not abandoned quiet, not echoing, but the quiet of things that are waiting rather than finished. I made coffee in my mother's kitchen. I took it to the front room, and I sat at Nana Eunice's sewing table, my table now, if any table can belong to a person, and I looked out the window at the street. A couple walking a dog. A child on a bicycle. The ordinary Saturday morning life of a neighborhood that had been here long before my family and would be here long after. I sat there for a long time. I drank my coffee. The light came through the window at the angle it had always come through, the same angle it had come through when I was 7 and then 17, and then a grown woman who drove 4 hours each way to be present in this room. There's something my mother used to say about property. Not about houses specifically, but about what endures. She would say, what you take care of takes care of you. She said it about plants, about the car, about relationships. She believed in the transaction of attention, that the things you showed up for would, in some form, show up for you. I don't know if she knew, when she filed that trust document 26 months before her death, what she was doing exactly. I don't know if she had already seen what was coming, or if she was simply doing what she had always done, paying attention, making decisions carefully, building something that would hold. But I think she knew. I think she had always known which one of us would show up. Here is what I've come to understand. Some people mistake calm for passivity. They see a person who doesn't argue, who doesn't threaten, who drives away quietly and comes back the next week and the week after, and they read that as weakness. They read it as someone who can be handed a moving notice and walked off a property that 4 generations of women made meaningful. What they don't account for is that quiet people keep records. They keep notebooks and shoeboxes. They remember dates. They know the name of every doctor and attorney and county officer who has ever touched something they love. They show up consistently, which means the people who matter see them showing up, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, those people make decisions accordingly. My mother wasn't passive either. She moved quietly through her life, and she made her arrangements without announcement. She called her attorney and she filed her document, and she had her capacity assessed so that no one could question it later, and then she said nothing, and she went back to her sewing table, and she waited. What Marcus mistook for a weak position was actually a completed one. That's my story. A deed filed in advance of everything. A title officer who read both documents out loud. And a sewing table that made it from Savannah to a corner lot in Millhaven, and is, as of the spring, exactly where my mother always intended it to be. I want to ask you something before you go, and I want you to really think about it. Have you ever shown up for someone, consistently, without recognition, without being asked, and then found out later that they had seen you the whole time, even when they never said so? Maybe it was a parent, a grandparent, someone who left something behind that told you everything you needed to know about how they felt. Drop your answer in the comments. I read them, and I want to know. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.